Hey, so in this video, we'll talk about how to tune up your table saw, which is useful for both new table saws and old table saws. It's really important for safety and really important for precise cuts. We'll go over a few strategies for aligning your blade, for making sure your table saw fence is nice and straight, a 5-cut method for ensuring your miter gauge is 90 degrees, so stay tuned. Now you'll need a few tools. You'll need a tape measure, you'll need a square reference surface such as a square, you'll need a way to fasten your fasteners, such as a set of Allen wrenches and a Phillips screwdriver. To align the table saw blade, we'll need a market, so a black felt tip marker is a good way for that. And then lastly, you'll need a manual. I've got a Delta manual for a Delta table saw. It's okay if you don't have a Delta table saw, just grab your manual or download it off the internet. Or stay tuned to the very end of this video where I teach you how to use AI and a large language model to explain the instructions to you. That's a pretty interesting use case, so stay tuned for that. And the first thing we need to align is the blade. And there's two things we need to align. We need to make sure it is 90 degrees upright. And we also need to make sure that it's parallel to the miter slot. So it could be slightly tilted this way or that way. The order of operations does matter here. You do need to make sure it's 90 degrees upright before we can determine whether it is tilted one way or another. So first things first, raise up the blade as high as this will go, and we'll use our square here and determine if there's any daylight between the blade and the edge of the square. So let's do this. Actually, help to remove the throat plate first, so do that first. The reason why it's helpful to remove the throat plate is because it may be tilted up a little bit too high and throw off the measurement here. So let's see if this is square. So you can see this is already pretty good. I've got this flat on the flat machined surface here, and I don't see any daylight, any shadows behind it. If I move my finger against the blade behind this, I don't see any shadows right there. So I'm looking for any kind of indication that there's a gap there. So if there was a gap there, this would be the time to adjust the table saw from this direction, but looks like I am already at 90 degrees, so that's great. Now there is another option you can use. I've got this little angle finder here, and what you do is you set it on a flat surface, you calibrate it. So which button is this? So it is on a flat surface. I'm going to zero it out, then I'm going to flip it against the blade, and let's see what it reads. All right, so that's reading, it's bobbling between 90 degrees, 90.1, and 89.9, so we are looking pretty good. But yeah, if you've got one of those, it's a great resource for determining the right angles. And the next thing we're going to do is determine if this blade is kind of tilted either way, one way or the other. This is actually really important because if you've got the fence to the right of this thing and the blade is pointed to the right, that means as wood is going to run past it, it's going to get pinched and you're going to get kicked back. That wood's going to go flying right back at you, and you don't want that. The general principle here is to basically get the saw blade parallel to the miter slot, and this is where the combination square comes in handy. Again, if you don't have a combination square, it's not terribly important. What you do need to do is you need something that can fit in the miter slot, that can slide in the miter slot, and that can project out a certain distance to the blade. What we're going to do is we're going to mark the distance between the miter slot and one point on the blade here. Then we're going to rotate that point back here and determine if that same point is the same distance to the miter slot back here. And if it's the same distance, that tells us it's parallel. So first things first, let us mark it somewhere on the blade here, just with the marker. This is why we needed a marker, just need some kind of point of reference here. And then I'm going to use my combination square and put it just so it's barely touching the table saw here. You need to ensure that this is flat up against the slot here. So I've got the dot just touching my combination square. I'm going to carefully lift this up, tie off this angle. So now we've got a fixed distance here. And now when I rotate this dot to the other side, I will now be able to determine if this is parallel. All right, so this is already parallel, so that is really great. While we're looking at the table saw blade, make sure you have a riving knife, make sure you have anti-kickback claws, Mine aren't on there right now, so I should probably put those back on. Yeah, let's lower the blade and then make sure that the throat plate is in a good position here. All right, ensuring the throat plate is nice and level is pretty simple here. On this table saw and a lot of table saws, there are little set screws that are throughout the border here of the throat plate insert. So all you need to do here is put in the throat plate, make sure you have all sawdust removed so you don't get a bad measurement here, and then take something that's got a flat edge and ensure that you're not pushing down on the throat plate. So I need to make some adjustments here because my throat plate is clearly up on the left side from this table saw. So I take the throat plate out, lower those screws a little bit, rinse and repeat until I get a flat surface from this side to that side of the throat plate. You can see here, I've lowered it too low. I'd rather be too low than too high, but you know what, I can back that screw out just a little bit and ensure that it is not too low. I'd rather it just be as flush as possible. All right, we're looking pretty close here. One quick tip, your fingers are going to be a really good indicator of whether something is flush or not. We can get all sorts of fancy gauges and combination squares and whatnot, but just a simple, hey, I'm rubbing this from one side to the other one, and this one feels like I'm going slightly up. That's really hard to pick up on any kind of tool that a normal woodworker might have, but most people have at least 9 or 10 fingers watching this video, so feel free to use your fingers to determine we've got a nice flush surface, and I know that I'm maybe a little bit low back here, just barely, and just barely high over here. So yeah, use those fingers. And now that we've got the table saw blade 90 degrees and straight parallel with the miter slot, got the throat plate ready, it's time to align the table saw fence. So let's do that next. In order to align the table saw fence, it's going to be the same process as before with the table saw blade and making sure it is parallel to the miter slot. So get out your combination square. We're going to put it into a miter slot and we're going to slide it up and down right next to the fence and see if it touches at one point on one side of the table saw, but it doesn't touch at the other side, or vice versa. And if so, we will need to adjust the alignment of our fence here. Well, my compound square is giving me a little bit of trouble here because I can't quite get it. I don't know, just not fitting very well into my miter slot. So I'm going to switch strategies, go to my square, and use this to determine if we are a fixed distance from the miter slot here. Okay, interesting. If anything, it now went about a 64th of an inch to the right, which is not what I was expecting. Let's try this again in this direction. All right, going down that direction, I needed to loosen the fence so that the square would close the gap that was created with the edge of the miter slot. So in other words, this was closer to the miter slot than that edge. So I think that means I need to adjust this. Again, this side is closer to the miter slot, which means it's crooked like this. And I will need to adjust that. All right, adjusting the fence on your table saw will vary depending on whether you've got a Delta saw or something else. I've got a Delta saw, so if you happen to also have a Delta saw, that's great because it's pretty simple for adjusting how parallel or what angle your fence is at. Make sure the lock is up, pull it out, flip it over, and then there are 2 set screws. One set screws on this side and one on that side. So this is the part where you find the right size Allen wrench in your bucket of Allen wrenches, and then move it in or out, whichever direction it needs to go. Put the fence back on there, run the same test, and rinse and repeat until you've figured out what is the correct amount of set screw distance to turn it to make this fence parallel. Boy, did I get lucky and get it on the first try? That would be amazing. So I may have gotten this right on the first try. Let me move those cords over. I've got the tiniest bit of space between the square and the fence here, probably 64th of an inch, as I hold this close to the miter slot. That same amount of space persists. That is actually looking pretty good. So we're going to call that good. And now I've got the throat plate, the table saw blade, and the table saw fence completely square and parallel to the miter slots. Next up, the miter gauge itself. Now there's 2 things we're going to check with the miter gauge. Obviously we want it to be 90 degrees perpendicular to the actual slot, but before we check whether it's 90 degrees, you also need to make sure there's no slack within the slot itself. So if we look at this, in goes the miter gauge. You hear that wiggle. That is side-to-side wiggle it has. And that is enough side-to-side wiggle that it can move it. You can change your measurement by, a half degree, maybe a full degree, depending on how much space there is. Again, your mileage will vary based on what type of table saw you have and what type of miter slot you have, if it's an aftermarket miter slot or miter gauge. But yeah, on this particular miter gauge, there are set screws on the side here. So yeah, I got to get the right Allen wrench and turn them until it gets nice and snug inside of this miter slot. Once it's nice and snug and moves freely, then I can make sure it's nice and square and perpendicular to the miter slot as well. Now you can see as I'm doing this, might be not be able to see it from that camera angle, but I got the set screws slightly out too far, and then they kind of bump into the side here. And it allows me to very finely tune this until it barely fits in there. All right, that is too much wiggle for my liking. So I'm going to try this one more time. I was turning it about 1/8 of a turn. Now I'm just going to barely turn it at all to get it to fit. If there are 3 set screws, here's the first one. Doesn't fit. There's some micro adjustments here. Well, I can't get it any finer than that. Obviously, you can audibly hear this thing. And the side-to-side motion is pretty minimal. Slightly annoyed by this, but I may come back and dial this in later. Hopefully you all will have better luck and success with your miter gauges. Maybe it's just this particular miter gauge that is just not working well for me. I'm close. All right, but next let's look into how to make this actual miter gauge 90 degrees and perpendicular with the slot itself. Obviously, a lot of these miter gauges will have 90-degree indicators on the back. Don't trust those at all. What you should trust is either a known square reference surface, or even better, make some square cuts. And I'll show you how to do that in just a moment here. So first things first, let's just get pretty close here and determine whether we are at 90 degrees. And we're pretty darn close. So I'm just going to skip straight to the method where you cut a square, rotate the square, make a few cuts, do it a few times, and we'll see if we can get really close to 90 degrees. So Check this out. Now this is the part where it's really convenient if you have 1/4 inch thick plywood or any kind of scrap. What I basically need is a square that will go from my left hand to past the blade. So maybe 10 inches to a foot long in length. I've got a round net from an old project here, so I'm going to get it down to roughly that size, and then I'll show you the square cut method. So let's get this thing running and make a square real quick. All right, so I've got a square, at least from this side. Doesn't really matter what the top looks like. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get my miter gauge back out. And I got it pretty close to 90 degrees right now. But even if it's not close to 90 degrees, the general principle we're going to apply here is to amplify your errors and then correct the amplified error. That way, when you experience the error on a more macro scale, it's barely perceptible. So if that doesn't make sense, just stay with me here. What I'm going to do is make a cut. Again, this is lined up against the miter gauge right here. Make a cut against this one side of the square. I'm now going to take the cut side, rotate it, and put that against the miter gauge and make another cut right against the next side of the square. Doesn't matter in terms of like how far off I'm on. I'm just going to barely cut this. And I'm going to do this 4 or 5 times. And after I do this 4 or 5 times, if my miter gauge is exactly perpendicular to my miter slot, then I should be able to take my square and take a look at it, and the square wood piece here should be exactly matching the right angle on here. If it's slightly acute or slightly obtuse, that tells me that the miter gauge is off in one direction or another. Now what you do is you take your most recently cut side, which is this side, compare it to how square it is with this side. So when I take a look at this, I can see, let's look at this together. We are going to be flush on the corner, the very top here. But I've got just a hairline showing down here. Actually, you know what? That's pretty close. So I'm flush on this corner, but I've got maybe a 1/16 of an inch right here. So I'm not exactly at 90 degrees. I think I may just nudge it just a touch because again, I'm amplifying my error by a factor of 5 here. So I definitely don't want to overcorrect. So I'm gonna make just the tiniest adjustment and we'll see if we can get this very close to 90 degrees. All right, going to attempt the tiniest adjustment possible here. This snaps into a slot at 90 degrees. If I loosen this, but the problem is that's not actually 90 degrees. It is ever so slightly off. I need to, let's see, turn this that way a bit. So if I turn it that way, this needs to go out. Means that needs to go out that way. Ooh, that's gonna be tough. So let's see how I want to do this. There's currently a hair to the right of 90, which is actually consistent with what I'm seeing here. Yeah, I'm all off now, but that's okay. Come back this way. I hope this doesn't move. Not the easiest way to be precise here. Let's give it somewhat of a firm turn there, confirm our positioning. We are, yeah, that's where I want to be. Double checking. We are, yeah, that is pretty decent. may have slightly overcorrected. There's a little bit further to the right of the 90-degree mark there. But if we try this all again, we can fine tune from here. So if I've overcorrected, but it's a smaller amount of gap, then I'm actually going to be okay with that, as long as I have it increase the amount of error. Let's try this again. All right, this was my most recently cut side, my least recently cut side. So I need to compare this side to this side. Let's have a look here. Flush against the top. You make the top flush right here. And this is where your fingers come into play. I'm ever so slightly too far right here. So in other words, I've overcorrected. Not a big deal. Now what I could do is split the difference. Do a quick time lapse. It shows you how I'm going to split the difference and make this even more precise than it already is. All right, need to compare that side to that side. See what we got. Flush up here. You can still feel it, but we are much closer. Let me see if you can even see our flush on the top. Again, the amount of metal you can see there is amplified by a factor of 5. This is as close to 90 degrees I think as I'm going to get it. So there it is. That is how you make your miter gauge as square as possible using the 5-cut square method. Now the last thing to confirm here is I've got my steel top and I've got what I would assume are aluminum wings that come out the side here. And what I want to do is make sure that all of that is flush, because what I wouldn't want is for one of these wings to be sort of too high or too low, and if I'm cutting a real wide piece, that'll cause the piece to tilt one way or another, thus making the work we did to make the blade 90 degrees kind of a moot point, because it won't be 90 degrees if the board is tilted. So let's get this going here. All you need for this is a clean work surface, which I'm making right now, and a straight edge that is long enough, such as a 6-foot level. This one you all know how to do. You don't really need me to explain it, but I'll explain it anyway. The level across clean surface. Wherever you see gaps, raise or lower one side or the other. So I'll do that, and then stay tuned for another minute or two. I'll show you a little trick for using AI to read your manual to you and be able to ask. You can ask it questions. This is a really good use case for AI. So hang out for another minute. I'll show you what that looks like. So let's talk about AI real quick. You may be wondering what business do I have talking about AI? Well, actually, woodworking is not my main job. Doing software is, and I do AI at work from time to time. The large language models that are becoming really prominent and powerful today are really good at text. And what people aren't particularly good at is text manuals. So it's pretty trivial to go to one of these LLM websites, ChatGPT, for example, say, hey, you're an expert advisor on a specific Delta table saw model. I've uploaded the manual as knowledge, reference it from the start, be concise, just give it some very basic instructions, download the actual manual from the internet and upload it. It's very convenient to be able to reference, especially in voice mode, where I could give it a prompt to say, hey, what was this Allen wrench size? And it'll tell it to me. So it's actually really convenient. So here are a few examples. Really interested if any of you have used AI or LLMs for this kind of use case, what kind of prompts you use. So feel free to add that to the comments. Thanks for watching. Hey, remind me what size Allen wrench I need for the set screws on my miter gauge.
You need a 332-inch Allen wrench to adjust the set screws on the miter gauge.
Hey, I'm going to adjust my table saw fence. I need to make it parallel with the miter slot. Remind me where the set screws or the adjustments are on this table saw fence.
To align the fence parallel to the miter slot on your Delta table saw, 1. Move the fence adjacent to the right miter gauge slot. 2. Locate the set screws on the fence clamping mechanism. These are used for fine adjustments. 3. If the fence is not parallel, lift it off the guide tube and adjust one or both set screws slightly. Turn them 1/4 turn or less. 4. Replace the fence on the guide tube and verify alignment.
What page of the manual is this from? I want to double check the figures.
The instructions for aligning the fence parallel to the miter slot are on page 25 of the manual. It includes figures showing the set screws and their adjustment.
I'm thinking about getting an aftermarket miter gauge. Can you remind me how wide the miter slot is on this table saw?
The miter slot on the Delta 36725T2 table saw is 3/4 of an inch, or 0.75 inches wide, and 3/8 of an inch, or 0.375 inches deep, a standard T-slot size.
Is that 3/4 of an inch the shallow part of the T or the wide part of the T?
The 3/4 of an inch, or 0.75 inches, refers to the wide part of the T-slot. The narrower, shallow part of the T-slot is designed to accommodate the T on the miter gauge bar.